Monster Energy is a $8 billion global juggernaut, but its true identity is built on a 90-year lie. The company was originally founded in 1935 as Hansen's Natural, a wholesome family-run juice company in California, known for organic apple juice and sodas. For 60 years, it was the safe choice. However, in a ruthless corporate pivot in 2002, the company completely betrayed its own heritage, led by two South African businessmen who bought the failing juice company for a mere $14.5 million. They weaponized caffeine to save it. They launched Monster, a drink with nearly double the caffeine of Red Bull, packaged in a 16-ounce can that screamed aggression. This pivot turned a sleepy juice brand into the best-performing stock of the entire 21st century, growing 3,400% in a decade. But this success came at a deadly cost. The brand has been besieged by lawsuits linking its products to cardiac arrests and deaths, forcing it to fight a perpetual legal war over the safety of its own ingredients. As of 2025, Monster Beverage Corporation is no longer a juice company. It is a caffeine delivery system that has successfully diversified into gaming, extreme sports, and alcohol, proving that in modern capitalism, being dangerous is far more profitable than being healthy. From family juice business to liquid energy, if you peel back the neon paint and the aggressive marketing, you find a history that seems almost like a hallucination. There is no boardroom fueled by greed here. There is only the quiet, dusty heat of Los Angeles in the middle of the Great Depression. It is 1935, and amidst the poverty, a family is planting the seeds of what will eventually become a global paradox. They believe they are building a legacy of health in the apple orchards. They have no idea they are laying the foundation for a caffeine empire. The year is 1935. The American dream is on life support, but in Los Angeles, a stern but kindly patriarch named Hubert Hansen has a simple, wholesome idea. He wants to sell fresh, unpasteurized juice to the film studios of Hollywood. He and his three sons founded Hansen's Fruit and Vegetable Juices, a company built on the very specific mid-century Californian ideal of health, vitality, and nature. For nearly 60 years, this company was the definition of purity. It was the anti-soda. It sold apple juice, orange juice, and later natural sodas sweetened with cane sugar, instead of the industrial high-fructose corn syrup that was taking over the rest of the country. It was a brand for mothers packing school lunches, for health nuts in yoga studios, and for children. It was safe. It was responsible. It was a company that believed genuinely that if you put good things into the bottle, good things would happen to the business. But the world of the late 20th century was not kind to innocence. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the beverage landscape had transformed into a brutal battlefield, dominated by global titans. Coca-Cola and PepsiCo had crushed the small players with their ruthless distribution networks and billion-dollar ad budgets. The new age beverage boom was beginning, with aggressive competitors like Snapple and Arizona Iced Tea entering the ring with flashy marketing and shelf-stable products. Hansen's, with its commitment to expensive natural ingredients and its lack of marketing muscle, was becoming a relic. It was a dinosaur in a digital age. The company, still technically run by the heirs of Hubert Hansen, was drifting toward irrelevance. It was a penny stock, trading for scraps on the pink sheets, managing a shrinking portfolio of natural sodas in a warehouse in Anaheim. The family was tired. They were looking for an exit. They wanted to save their grandfather's legacy, but they didn't know how to fight in a world that no longer cared about natural. And in 1992, the exit arrived. But it didn't come in the form of a juice lover or a white knight who wanted to preserve the sanctity of the apple orchards. It came in the form of a shark. Rodney Sachs was not a beverage man. He was a South African lawyer, a man forged in the complex, high-stakes, and often brutal world of corporate litigation in Johannesburg. He had emigrated to California with his family, not to make juice, but to make a fortune. He was joined by his compatriot Hilton Schlossberg, a fellow South African and a financial genius with a mind like a diamond, cold, hard, and sharp. These two men were not looking for Hanson's, they were looking for a shell. They were corporate raiders in search of a publicly traded vehicle that they could buy, strip down, and use to build an empire. They looked at the books of Hanson's Natural and saw a tragedy, but they also saw an opportunity. They saw a company with $17 million in sales, a pittance, and a distribution network that was barely functioning. But they also saw that the brand had no significant debt and a clean legal reputation. It was a perfect, empty vessel. In 1992, Sachs and Schlossberg led a consortium to buy the company for $14.5 million. It was a bargain basement price for a 60-year-old heritage brand. They paid cash. The Hanson family walked away, perhaps believing they had saved the company. They had no idea they had just handed the keys to two men who would eventually erase everything Hubert Hanson stood for. For the first few years, from 1992 to 1997, the South African Cowboys, as they were whispered about in the industry, tried to play the game the old way. They tried to run Hanson's as a better juice company. They modernized the labels. They launched Hanson's Energy, a natural ginseng-based smoothie drink that tasted like vitamins and hope. They played by the rules of the health market, and they struggled. The natural beverage market was a grinding war of attrition with razor-thin margins. The stock price languished. The juice business was a trap. It was a commodity game where the price of apples could ruin your quarter. Sachs and Schlossberg, men accustomed to winning, were staring at mediocrity. But Rodney Sachs possessed a trait that was far more valuable than brewing experience. He was an obsessive observer. He watched the market with the intensity of a predator. And in 1997, during a trip to London, he saw something that made the hair on his arms stand up. He walked into a bar and saw young people mixing vodka with a drink from a strange, slender, blue and silver can. It was called Red Bull. It wasn't a soda. It wasn't a juice. It was a functional drink. It tasted like liquid candy, medicinal, sweet, and chemical. It cost a fortune, $2 for a tiny 8.3-ounce can, a price per ounce that was higher than gasoline. And young people were buying it by the case. Sachs stood there and did the math in his head. He realized instantly that Red Bull wasn't selling liquid. They were selling a legal stimulant. They were selling energy. The margins were astronomical. A can of Coke cost pennies to make and sold for $1. A can of Red Bull cost pennies to make and sold for $2. In 1997, Red Bull officially entered the United States. It exploded. It created the energy drink category overnight. It was the cool European Formula One sponsoring brand that made Coke look like geriatric water. Sachs looked at his own portfolio back in Anaheim. Hanson's Natural Soda, apple juice, smoothies. These were products for the past. He realized with a chilling clarity that if he stayed in the juice business, he would remain a small, irrelevant player forever. He had to pivot. He had to kill the spirit of Hubert Hanson to save the company. But he faced a massive strategic problem. He couldn't just copy Red Bull. Red Bull had the first mover advantage. They owned the premium space. They were the champagne of energy drinks. If Hanson's launched a copycat 8-ounce can, they would be crushed. They would be seen as the cheap knockoff. A 60-year-old juice company from California couldn't outcool an Austrian marketing machine. So, Sachs decided to do what Pepsi did in the 1930s during the Great Depression. He decided to win on value and aggression. He decided to go to war not with style, but with brute force. Rodney Sachs retreated into the laboratory, not to create a better juice, but to engineer a liquid weapon. He instructed his flavor chemist to ignore the 60-year natural heritage of the company. He didn't want subtle, he didn't want organic, and he certainly didn't want healthy. He wanted a flavor profile that was sweet, salty, and savory all at once, a chemical punch that hit the back of the throat and stayed there, masking the bitter, medicinal taste of the massive caffeine load he was planning to inject. But the flavor was secondary to the packaging. Sachs looked at the American consumer, the long-haul truck driver, the construction worker, the college student pulling an all-nighter, and he understood their psychology better than they did themselves. He knew they looked at the tiny, dainty 8.3-ounce Red Bull can and felt cheated. It looked European. It looked weak. It cost $2 for a few sips. Sachs decided to weaponize the American appetite for excess. He found a massive 16-ounce beer can, double the size of Red Bull. He decided to fill it with his new neon green concoction, load it with 160 milligrams of caffeine, and sell it for the exact same price. It was the nickel strategy of Pepsi from the 1930s, reincarnated for the adrenaline age, double the buzz for the same buck. He needed a name that would shatter the Hansen's image forever. Hansen's Energy sounded like something your yoga teacher would drink. He needed a name that sounded dangerous, something that implied size, power, and a lack of restraint. He and his team looked at the imposing black can and the radioactive-looking liquid inside, and they christened it Monster. For the logo, they bypassed the polished Madison Avenue ad agencies and hired a graphic designer from a California surf company. They wanted something primal. They came up with the M-Claw, 3 jagged neon green tears ripping through a black background. It didn't look corporate. It looked like a werewolf had clawed its way out of the can. It was aggressive, it was masculine, and to the moral guardians of the era, it looked almost satanic. It was the complete antithesis of the wholesome apple juice that had built the company. In April 2002, they launched, but they did so with a calculated deception. Sachs knew that if the teenage boys in the mosh pits knew this drink was made by the apple juice people, the brand would be dead on arrival, so they hid the name. Hansen's Natural appeared only in tiny microscopic print on the back of the can, a legal necessity buried under the ingredients list. They didn't buy Super Bowl ads, they didn't have the money. Instead, they launched a guerrilla war. They sent ambassador teams, vans painted black and green, to the places where the other brands were afraid to go. They went to dirt tracks, motocross rallies, punk rock festivals, and skate parks. They didn't sell the drink, they gave it away. They handed ice-cold 16-ounce cans to sweaty, adrenaline-filled teenagers, creating a direct neurological link between the Monster brand and the rush of dopamine. The reaction was visceral and immediate. The kids saw the claw marks. They felt the heavy, substantial weight of the 16-ounce can in their hands. They tasted the aggressive, sugary rush, and then they felt the caffeine hit them like a freight train. It worked. The sales were not a slow burn. They were a detonation. In 2002, the company's revenue was a struggling $50 million. By 2006, it was $500 million. By 2011, it was $1.7 billion. The stock price did something that no one on Wall Street believed was possible for a beverage company. It began a meteoric climb that would eventually make it the single best performing stock of the entire 21st century, delivering returns higher than Apple, Amazon, or Google. Rodney Sachs, the South African lawyer, had done it. He had taken a dying, wholesome juice company and turned it into a caffeine delivery system for a new generation. But in his race to unleash the beast, Sachs had created something he couldn't fully control. He'd built a brand on the promise of maximum energy and no limits. He had pushed the boundaries of what was legally and medically acceptable to put in a beverage sold to minors. He had marketed a potent stimulant to teenagers, wrapping it in the seductive aesthetics of danger and rebellion. As the sales climbed, so did the stakes. The idealistic rise of Monster was about to collide with the biological reality of the human heart. The doctors were starting to ask questions. Parents were starting to read the labels. And the personal injury lawyers, the very profession Sachs had come from, were starting to circle. The company was generating billions, but this aggressive expansion was about to collide with a fatal reality: fighting for corporate survival. By the winter of 2011, Rodney Sachs and Hilton Schlossberg stood at the undisputed summit of the beverage world. In less than a decade, they had engineered a financial miracle, transforming a dusty, bankrupt juice company into a $1.7 billion empire that was growing faster than Google. They had successfully tapped into the raw, uninhibited ID of the American teenager, creating a brand that was synonymous with the invincibility. The M-Claw was not just a logo, it was a flag planted on the concept of no limits. But in December 2011, in a quiet courtroom in Maryland, the concept of no limits collided violently with the biological reality of the human heart. The momentum of the idealistic rise did not just slow down. It hit a brick wall constructed of grief, outraged parents, and a stack of wrongful death lawsuits that threatened to dismantle the entire industry. The catalyst for this crisis was a tragedy that was heartbreaking in its simplicity. A 14-year-old girl named Anaïs Fournier went to the movies with her friends, engaging in the typical rites of passage of an American teenager. Over the course of 24 hours, she consumed 2 24-ounce mega cans of Monster Energy. To the average consumer, this might have seemed excessive, but harmless, just a sugar rush. But to a cardiologist, it was a math equation of potential disaster. That volume of fluid contained 480 milligrams of caffeine, roughly the equivalent of chugging 14 cans of Coca-Cola in a single day. Anaïs had an underlying undiagnosed genetic heart condition known as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a weakness in the connective tissues that made her blood vessels fragile. After finishing the second can, her heart went into arrhythmia. She went into cardiac arrest. 6 days later, she was taken off life support, and she died. When her parents filed a lawsuit against Monster Beverage Corporation, it was not treated as a standard product liability case. It was treated by the media as a murder trial for an entire category. The lawsuit argued a terrifying premise: that Monster Energy was not a beverage, but a lethal weapon disguised as a soft drink. It claimed that the company was negligently marketing a potent, unregulated stimulant to children who had no concept of the risks, and that the company had failed to warn consumers that their product could kill. The narrative was devastatingly effective. For a decade, Monster had marketed itself as fuel, a harmless accelerant for a fun, extreme life. Overnight, the narrative flipped. The fuel was now branded as poison. The headlines were brutal, relentless, and global. "Can energy drinks kill?" flashed across CNN and the BBC. The monster in the can became a talking point on morning shows. The FDA announced it was investigating reports of 5 deaths and 1 non-fatal heart attack linked to the consumption of Monster Energy. A group of 18 doctors and researchers sent a frantic public letter to the FDA urging them to regulate energy drinks with the same severity as tobacco or alcohol, arguing that caffeine toxicity was a public health emergency. The city attorney of San Francisco, Dennis Herrera, launched a high-profile lawsuit accusing the company of predatory marketing, specifically targeting minors with a product that their developing bodies could not handle. The stock price, which had been the darling of Wall Street, plummeted. The South African cowboys were no longer seen as geniuses. They were being painted as merchants of death. Rodney Sachs, the lawyer turned CEO, found himself facing the greatest challenge of his career. A traditional American CEO faced with the death of a child and a PR firestorm might have followed the standard crisis management playbook, issue a humble, somber apology, settle the lawsuit quietly to make the headlines go away, and perhaps reformulate the drink to lower the caffeine content as a gesture of good faith. It would have been the safe, PR-friendly move. But Rodney Sachs was not a PR man. He was a litigator. He was a man who had spent his life in the adversarial trenches of corporate law. He looked at the lawsuit, and he didn't see a tragedy to be managed. He saw a threat to be destroyed. He believed that if he gave an inch, if he apologized, if he settled, if he admitted even a shred of liability, he would be opening the floodgates. If he admitted that Monster was dangerous, the entire business model, the entire $1.7 billion empire built on the promise of extreme energy would collapse under the weight of regulation and class action lawsuits. So, Monster went to war. The defense strategy that Sachs orchestrated was cold, hard, and scientifically aggressive. He decided to fight the emotional narrative of the grieving parents with a rational narrative of chemical facts. He refused to settle the Fournier case. Instead, he went on the offensive. Monster's legal team pointed out a simple, uncomfortable fact that the media hysteria was conveniently ignoring. A 16-ounce can of Monster Energy contains approximately 160 milligrams of caffeine. A 16-ounce cup of Starbucks Pike Place coffee, the kind consumed by millions of Americans every morning without a second thought, contains 330 milligrams of caffeine, more than double the amount in a Monster. Sachs repeated this statistic in every deposition and every interview. He turned the accusation back on society. Why, he argued, is it perfectly legal and socially acceptable for a 14-year-old to walk into a Starbucks and buy a venti coffee with 400 milligrams of caffeine, yet it is considered lethal negligence if they drink a Monster with half that amount? He argued that the danger was a myth created by bad science and moral panic. He hired teams of cardiologists and toxicologists to testify that caffeine, in the amounts present in Monster, was safe for the general population. He argued that Anaïs Fournier's death, while tragic, was caused by her genetic condition, not by his drink. It was a ruthless defense. It was a defense that lacked empathy but possessed immense legal weight. The legal war raged for years, costing the company millions of dollars in fees and dragging its reputation through the mud. Every motion filed, every expert witness called, kept the story in the news cycle. Parents began banning the drink from their homes. High schools across the country started confiscating the black and green cans, treating them like contraband. The M-Claw logo, which had once signaled cool rebellion, began to signal illicit risk. The brand was becoming toxic, but Sachs held the line. He bet the entire company on the idea that he could win in court, even if he was losing in the court of public opinion. He believed that eventually the science would vindicate him, and that the consumers, the teenagers who wanted the buzz, would not be scared away by the danger, but arguably would be attracted to it. He was gambling that the controversy would not kill the brand, but would instead harden its identity as the bad boy of the beverage world. While Rodney Sachs was fighting the health wars in the courtrooms of Maryland and San Francisco, a second, quieter but equally lethal war was being waged in the loading docks and backrooms of American retail. The outlaw image that had fueled the brand's meteoric rise was beginning to choke its operational arteries. For a decade, Monster had relied on a distribution network that was as unconventional as its marketing: the beer trucks. In the early days, Sachs had struck deals with Anheuser-Busch distributors. It was a brilliant move at the time. Beer drivers knew how to get heavy cases of liquid into gas stations and convenience stores, the exact places where young men bought energy drinks. But as Monster grew into a multi-billion-dollar giant, the beer network began to fail. The beer distributors, naturally, prioritized their own product. When a Bud Light promotion happened, Monster was pushed to the back of the truck. When a cooler was full, Monster was left on the floor. Sachs realized with frustration that he was fighting a two-front war. He was defending the safety of his product to the public while simultaneously begging his own distributors to put it on the shelf. This distribution bottleneck was exacerbated by the global fallout of the health wars. The controversy surrounding Anaïs Fournier's death didn't just stay in America, it crossed the Atlantic. European regulators, historically far more precautionary and strict than the FDA, looked at the American lawsuits with alarm. Countries like France had already fought a bitter, years-long war to ban Red Bull, only capitulating after forced by EU trade laws. Now Monster was arriving on their shores with even higher caffeine levels and a deadly reputation. Sachs found himself hitting a regulatory wall. In parts of Europe and Asia, the brand was treated not as a beverage, but as a controlled substance. He was forced into a game of whack-a-mole, reformulating the drink country by country, lowering caffeine here, removing taurine there, trying to navigate a labyrinth of health codes while maintaining the kick that defined the brand. The South African cowboys realized that their renegade status, once their greatest asset, was now a liability. To conquer the world, to break out of the U.S. and into the massive markets of China and South America, they couldn't be outlaws anymore. They needed a passport. They needed legitimacy. They needed a partner so powerful, so established, and so ubiquitous that no health regulator or distributor would dare touch them. They needed the king. In 2014, amidst the swirling lawsuits and the bad press, Rodney Sachs initiated a series of secret high-stakes negotiations with the very company that had tried and failed to crush him for a decade, the Coca-Cola Company. For years, Coke had looked at the energy drink market with a mix of envy and incompetence. They had launched Full Throttle, Burn, Mother, and Relentless, corporate attempts to capture the extreme magic of Monster. They had all failed. Coke's corporate culture was too slow, too safe, too polite to build a brand that resonated with the mosh pit demographic. Coke had the trucks, but they didn't have the soul. Monster had the soul, but they didn't have the trucks. The synergy was obvious, but the deal was dangerous. Sachs knew that if he sold too much control, Coke would suffocate the beast with bureaucracy. He had to structure a deal that gave him the power of Coke without the leash. The resulting agreement, announced in 2015, was not just a partnership. It was a masterstroke of corporate surgery that fundamentally reshaped the global beverage map. Coca-Cola purchased a 16.7% stake in Monster for a staggering $2.15 billion. But the cash was the least important part of the deal. The true genius lay in the swap. It was a ruthlessly efficient exchange of hostages. Coca-Cola agreed to transfer ownership of all its failed energy brands to Monster. In return, Monster agreed to transfer ownership of all its non-energy brands to Coke. This meant handing over Hansen's Natural Soda and Peace Tea. It was the final symbolic severing of the cord. Rodney Sachs officially killed the last remnant of Hubert Hansen's 1935 juice company. He traded the family legacy for global dominance. He sacrificed the natural past to secure the chemical future. The effectiveness of this deal was immediate and transformative. Overnight, the distribution problem vanished. Monster cans were moved from the back of beer trucks to the front of the red Coca-Cola fleet. They were given prime placement in the millions of red vending machines, cinema chains, and university campuses that Coke controlled exclusively. The health war didn't end, but the dynamic changed. When critics attacked Monster for being dangerous, they were now attacking a partner of Coca-Cola. The red shield of Coke provided a layer of corporate respectability that Sachs had never possessed. The deal allowed Monster to bypass the beer stigma and enter markets like China and India with the full force of the world's most sophisticated supply chain behind them. The stock price, which had been battered by the lawsuits, skyrocketed again. Sachs had successfully engaged the cheat code of the beverage industry. However, this victory came with a new, darker internal reality. The company was now structurally addicted to its own intensity. By shedding the Hansen's juice brands, Monster had burned its lifeboats. It was now a pure-play energy company. It had no healthy division to fall back on if the FDA ever decided to ban caffeine. The company's entire $30 billion valuation rested on a single premise: that young people would continue to drink massive amounts of stimulants, regardless of the health warnings. The health wars settled into a permanent, low-level siege. The lawsuits from 2012 didn't stop. They just became a line item on the balance sheet, a cost of doing business like aluminum or sugar. Sachs built a legal fortress, settling cases quietly when necessary, fighting them loudly when strategic, always maintaining the stance that the beast was misunderstood. But as the 2000s came to a close, a new threat emerged. It wasn't a lawyer or a regulator, it was a competitor. A new wave of super energy drinks, led by a brand called Bang Energy, appeared on the scene. They were selling super creatine. They had 300 milligrams of caffeine, double what was in a Monster. They were targeting the gym crowd, the bodybuilders, the people for whom extreme wasn't about skateboarding, but about aesthetics. Monster, the rebel, was suddenly looking like the establishment. To survive the next decade, Sachs knew he couldn't just rely on Coke's trucks. He needed a new cultural frontier. He needed to find a demographic that was growing faster than sports, faster than music, and was even more addicted to stimulation than the skaters. By 2017, the health wars had mutated into a strange and paradoxical stalemate. Monster had survived the wrongful death lawsuits and the FDA inquiries not by proving it was healthy, but by proving it was legally compliant. The Coca-Cola partnership had secured its global borders, turning the M-Claw into an omnipresent fixture of the civilized world. However, this very ubiquity created a new danger that Rodney Sachs, with his sharp predator's instinct, had not anticipated. Monster was becoming safe. It was becoming the dad rock of energy drinks. The teenagers who had discovered the brand in 2002 were now fathers in their 30s. The brand had lost its edge, and in the vacuum created by Monster's drift toward the mainstream, a new monster emerged from the swamps of Florida to challenge the throne. This rival was Bang Energy, led by a CEO named Jack Owoc, a man who made Al Copeland look sedated. Owoc didn't just sell energy drinks. He sold a lifestyle of neon-colored, screaming intensity. He marketed super creatine. He put 300 milligrams of caffeine in a single can, nearly double the amount in a standard Monster. He claimed his drink could cure Alzheimer's and reverse mental retardation. While Monster was stuck in courtrooms defending its 160 milligram caffeine limit, Bang was out on social media, telling the gym rat generation that Monster was weak. Bang was targeting a demographic that Monster had neglected, the fitness obsession. They weren't selling grunge, they were selling gains. For Rodney Sachs, this was a nightmare scenario. He was watching history repeat itself, but this time, he was the slow-moving incumbent being flanked by the aggressive upstart. Bang was stealing the bad boy crown. The health war shifted fronts. It was no longer about defending safety. It was a caffeine arms race. The market was proving that consumers didn't care about the heart risks. They wanted more power, not less. If Monster stayed at 160 milligrams, they looked like a soda. If they went to 300 milligrams, they risked reigniting the FDA investigations and the wrongful death lawsuits. Sachs was trapped between the regulators who wanted him to slow down and the market that demanded he speed up. True to his nature as a litigator, Sachs decided to fight this new war on two fronts, the shelf and the courtroom. He didn't panic. He plotted. He realized that Bang's greatest strength, its wild, unsubstantiated health claims about supercreatine, was also its legal Achilles heel. Sachs unleashed his legal team, not to defend Monster, but to destroy Bang. Monster sued Bang Energy for false advertising, arguing that supercreatine was a chemical lie, a useless compound that did nothing for muscle growth. It was a brutal, years-long, scorched earth legal campaign designed to bleed his rival dry. Sachs wasn't just competing. He was trying to erase the competition through litigation. Simultaneously, Sachs ordered his R&D team to build a Bang killer. They created Reign Total Body Fuel. It was a shameless clone. It had 300 milligrams of caffeine. It had BCAAs. It came in the same neon colors, but it had the power of the Coca-Cola distribution system behind it. Sachs used the Coke trucks to muscle Reign onto the shelves right next to Bang, often buying up the shelf space to physically push his rival out of the consumer's eye line. It was a ruthless display of corporate power. It proved that while Monster might have lost its underdog soul, it had gained the crushing weight of a monopoly. This era of the health wars, stretching from 2017 to the early 2020s, revealed the cynical truth of the industry. The lawsuits regarding Inai Fournier had faded from the headlines, replaced by a cold, calculated battle for market share, where health was just a marketing buzzword. Monster successfully navigated this by playing both sides. They kept the original Monster safe for the masses and the regulators, while launching Reign for the hardcore addicts, insulating the main brand from the high caffeine heat. They had effectively segmented the market based on tolerance levels. But as the dust settled on the Bang conflict, Sachs looked at the horizon and saw that the next generation of consumers wasn't in the gym. They weren't at the motocross track. They were sitting in chairs. They were staring at monitors. The health war regarding physical hearts was ending, but the war for mental energy was just beginning. The gamers were waiting, and they didn't care about creatine. They cared about focus. By 2025, the legal landscape surrounding Monster Energy had evolved from a series of explosive, headline-grabbing lawsuits into a quiet, permanent state of siege warfare. The Inai Fournier case and the flurry of litigation that followed in the mid-2000s did not result in the ban that activists had hoped for, nor did it result in the vindication that Rodney Sachs had fought for. Instead, it resulted in a compromise etched in fine print. If you pick up a can of Monster today, spin it around, and squint at the back, you will see the scars of the war. The consumer responsibility statement is there, advising against consumption by children, pregnant women, and those sensitive to caffeine. It is a legal shield, a paragraph of text that cost millions of dollars in lawyer fees to draft. It is the company's way of saying, "We warned you." This label is the truce line. It allows the company to keep selling its high-octane formula while giving regulators just enough cover to look away. But the health wars left a deeper, invisible mark on the company's DNA. It forced Monster to become a paranoid organization. The headquarters in Corona, California, operates less like a beverage company and more like a fortified compound. The legal department is as powerful as the marketing department. Every new flavor, every new campaign is scrutinized not just for coolness, but for liability. The company has learned that its greatest threat is not a competitor, but a plaintiff. This constant pressure has made them ruthless. They aggressively trademark every variation of the word monster and the letter M, suing small businesses, fish shops, and even video games that dare to use a claw-like mark. They are fighting a health war on one front and a trademark war on the other, protecting their territory with a ferocity that borders on obsession. This is the cost of selling a product that lives on the edge of medical safety. You cannot let your guard down for a second. Yet financially, the strategy of deny, defend, and dominate has been an unqualified success. The stock price has continued its relentless climb, immune to the moral arguments against the product. The revenue in 2024 hit $7.49 billion, proving that the global appetite for stimulation far outweighs the global concern for health. The South African cowboys proved that you can build an empire on a product that half the world thinks is dangerous, as long as the other half thinks it's essential. They proved that addiction, whether psychological or physiological, is the ultimate business mode. But Sachs knew that the energy drink as a physical object had reached its peak. The cans were on every shelf, the lawsuits were managed, the health war was a stalemate. To grow for another decade, to justify the $60 billion valuation, he needed to find a new battlefield where the regulators were slower, the parents were absent, and the addiction was even more potent. He needed a place where health was irrelevant and performance was God. He looked at the data and he saw the future. The kids weren't at the skate park anymore. They were inside, they were plugged in, they were gaming, and in that digital darkness, Sachs saw the light. The next chapter of the Monster story wouldn't be written in courtrooms or hospitals. It would be written in the glowing arenas of esports, where the only heart rate that mattered was the one that kept you alive in the game. The health wars were over. The console wars were about to begin. Why did Monster bet billions on video games and alcohol? While the rest of the industry was still fighting over skydivers and rally cars, Rodney Sachs saw the ground shifting beneath them. The era of dirt and gasoline was fading. The American teenager was changing habits. They were spending less time outdoors and more time plugged in. The screen was rapidly replacing the street. Sachs understood a terrifying truth. If Monster kept chasing the X Games crowd, they would become a relic of the early 2000s. They needed a pivot. They needed a new arena that demanded intense focus and chemically assisted stamina, an arena that the rest of Wall Street dismissed as child's play. They found it in the glowing caffeine-fueled underground of the gaming community. In 2011, the concept of esports, professional video gaming, was still largely treated as a punchline by mainstream advertisers. Blue-chip companies like Nike, Pepsi, or Ford wouldn't touch it. They saw gamers through the lens of tired stereotypes, unhealthy loners in their parents' basements with no purchasing power and no social influence. But Monster saw something else. They saw a massive, untapped demographic of millions of young men who were hyper-engaged, intensely competitive, and crucially, chronically sleep-deprived. They realized that gaming was not a passive hobby. It was a cognitive endurance sport. A professional gamer needed the same reaction times as a Formula One driver, the same hand-eye coordination as a fighter pilot, but they had to sustain that peak performance for 12, 14, 16 hours at a time. They didn't need hydration. Gatorade was useless to them. They needed a buzz. They needed sugar for the brain and caffeine for the reflexes. Monster Energy wasn't just a sponsor for this world, it was a utility. It was performance-enhancing fuel. This was the reason for the pivot. It was a decision born from a deep understanding of the physiology of the digital age. While their competitors were still fighting for expensive billboard space at football stadiums to reach a broad, diluted audience, Monster quietly began to invade the digital arena where the audience was concentrated and desperate for recognition. They began sponsoring teams like Evil Geniuses in 2011, one of the most storied and successful franchises in the history of esports. This wasn't a standard sponsorship where they just slapped a logo on a jersey. It was an infrastructural integration. Monster stocked the team houses, the dormitories where pro gamers lived and trained together, with industrial fridges packed with green cans. They made the drink part of the daily diet of the players. When a gamer streamed their practice sessions on Twitch, a platform that was just beginning to explode, there was always a can of Monster sitting on the desk, not as a prop, but as a tool. It sent a powerful subliminal signal to the millions of kids watching. To play like a pro, you have to drink what the pros drink. The effectiveness of this strategy was a masterclass in demographic capture. By being the first major non-tech brand to take gamers seriously, Monster bought a level of loyalty that money usually can't buy. To the gaming community, which had been marginalized and bullied by mainstream culture for decades, Monster wasn't just an advertiser. They were a patron. They were the brand that got it when everyone else was making fun of them. This created a defensive moat around the brand that was impenetrable to Red Bull. Red Bull eventually tried to catch up, launching their own gaming initiatives, but they were late. Monster had already become the default drink of the digital native. The numbers were staggering. The partnership with leagues like ESL Gaming and the sponsorship of The International, the Super Bowl of Dota 2 with multi-million-dollar prize pools, put the M-Claw in front of 100 million unique viewers. This was an audience larger than the NBA Finals, but significantly younger, more global, and harder to reach via traditional TV. This diversification into gaming didn't just sell cans, it refreshed the brand's soul. It successfully transferred the bad boy energy from the physical risk of motocross to the digital risk of the server, ensuring that Monster remained the fuel of choice for the next generation of rebels. However, this pivot was not without its own dark internal drama and external criticism. By tying their brand so closely to the gaming lifestyle, Monster inadvertently waded into a new controversy: screen addiction. The health wars of Part 3 had focused on the acute danger of cardiac arrest, but the gaming wars focused on the chronic danger of a sedentary lifestyle. Critics, parents, and health advocates argued that Monster was fueling a toxic cycle, encouraging kids to stay awake for 24-hour marathons, substituting sleep with caffeine, and enabling a lifestyle that led to obesity and social isolation. The image of the toxic gamer screaming at a screen surrounded by empty energy drink cans became a cultural meme, a stereotype that the brand had to navigate carefully. They were selling performance, but they were accused of selling toxicity. Yet, financially, the gaming pivot was the engine that kept the company growing at double digits while the rest of the soda industry flattened. It diversified their revenue stream away from the gas station and into the digital subscription economy. If the FDA cracked down on marketing to kids on TV, Monster was safe because they weren't marketing on TV. They were marketing on Twitch, a platform the regulators barely understood and rarely watched. They had built a parallel marketing ecosystem, invisible to parents, but omnipresent to their children, securing a pipeline of addiction that would last for another decade. By the dawn of the 2020s, the gaming pivot had successfully secured the loyalty of the digital generation, creating a fortress of youth culture that insulated Monster from the aging stagnation that plagued its rivals. But Rodney Sachs and Hilton Schlossberg were not men who rested on their laurels. They were financial sharks who smelled blood in the water. They looked at the beverage landscape and saw a final uncrossed frontier, a market that was even more profitable, more regulated, and more culturally potent than energy drinks, alcohol. For 20 years, Monster had danced around the edges of the party culture. It was the undisputed king of the mixer. The vodka Monster was the grittier, cheaper cousin of the vodka Red Bull, the fuel for late nights, bad decisions, and college parties across America. But Monster itself had never sold the buzz, only the energy. Sachs realized a terrifying demographic truth. His core customers, the gamers, the skaters, the soldiers who had grown up with the brand in the 2000s, were aging. They were entering their 30s. They were trading their green energy cans for beer cans and hard seltzers. He was losing his customers to adulthood. So, in a move that terrified health regulators and thrilled Wall Street, Monster decided to grow up with them. In 2022, the company announced a $330 million acquisition of the Canarchy Craft Brewery Collective. On the surface, to the casual observer, it looked like a confused late attempt to buy into the fading craft beer trend. Analysts scratched their heads. Why would a caffeine company want a portfolio of niche IPAs? In reality, it was a strategic masterstroke designed to bypass the single most difficult regulatory hurdle in the beverage world, the alcohol manufacturing and distribution license. By buying an existing, fully licensed brewery network, Monster didn't just buy beer, they bought the legal right to manufacture and distribute hard alcohol immediately, without waiting years for permits. This was the reason for the pivot. Canarchy was the Trojan horse that allowed them to launch their most controversial product yet, the Beast Unleashed. The Beast Unleashed was a product designed with cynical brilliance. It was a 6% alcohol by volume malt beverage, but it didn't taste like beer. It tasted exactly like the original Monster energy drink. It was a literal weaponization of nostalgia. It allowed a 32-year-old construction worker or a 30-year-old accountant who had grown up chugging Monster while playing Halo 2 to experience the exact same flavor profile they loved, but now with the intoxicating kick of alcohol they craved. It blurred the lines between energy and intoxication, creating a new hybrid category that regulators struggled to define. It wasn't an energy drink, but it felt like one. It sold the memory of energy. The effectiveness of this alcohol pivot was immediate and financially potent. It unlocked a massive new drinking occasion, the night out, that Monster had previously only participated in passively. It diversified the revenue stream even further, insulating the company from potential crackdowns on caffeine by planting a flag in the equally regulated but culturally distinct world of alcohol. If the FDA banned energy drinks tomorrow, Monster now had a liquor license. It was the ultimate hedge. But Sachs knew that product diversification wasn't enough. The brand aesthetics themselves had to evolve. The dirt and motocross aesthetic of the 2000s was becoming dated, a relic of the Jackass era. To remain the king of the bad boy image in 2024 and 2025, Monster had to elevate its aesthetic from the mud to the asphalt. They had to become premium. This drove the final, most visible leg of their diversification, the pivot to high-octane lifestyle. In 2023 and 2024, Monster aggressively expanded its footprint in Formula One, partnering with McLaren. This was a deliberate, calculated shift away from the redneck stereotype of their early NASCAR roots toward the elite, global, and hyper-expensive world of F1. It signaled to the market that Monster wasn't just for kids in basements, it was for the global elite. It was for people who liked fast cars, expensive watches, and international travel. They launched lifestyle gear lines, not just cheap promotional t-shirts thrown from a van, but high-quality streetwear and racing gear that tapped into the racing core fashion trend. They were no longer just a sponsor, they were a fashion label. The M-Claw began to appear on designer hoodies and limited edition racing liveries, becoming a symbol of speed and luxury rather than just a caffeine delivery system. The pivot was complete. Monster had successfully transitioned from a drink for kids to a lifestyle for adults, securing its relevance for another generation. As we stand in 2025, surveying the landscape of the global beverage industry, the transformation of the South African Cowboys is not just complete, it is absolute. The company that started as a failing $14 million juice business in a warehouse in Anaheim is now a financial fortress with a market capitalization hovering near $60 billion. The revenue figures are staggering, with 2024 closing at $7.49 billion and trailing 12-month revenue hitting nearly $8 billion in 2025. But the most jaw-dropping statistic, the one that is whispered with reverence on Wall Street trading floors, is the stock performance. A $1,000 investment in Monster Beverage Corporation in 2002 would be worth nearly $1 million today. This return dwarfs the growth of Apple, Amazon, Google, and even Tesla over the same period. Rodney Sachs and Hilton Schlossberg didn't just build a drink company. They built the single most effective wealth generation machine of the 21st century, and they did it by selling sugar and caffeine while the rest of the world was obsessed with microchips and software. This financial triumph is the direct result of the relentless multi-front diversification strategy. They have achieved a level of vertical integration that is rare in the consumer goods world. They control the morning with their coffee hybrids, the afternoon with their core energy line, the workout with Reign, the night with the Beast Unleashed alcohol, and the digital life with their gaming dominance. They have successfully monetized every hour of a young man's day. The partnership with Coca-Cola, once viewed as a risky surrender of independence, has matured into the ultimate force multiplier. The red trucks take the cans to the ends of the earth, insulating Monster from the logistical nightmares that plague smaller competitors. While Bang Energy filed for bankruptcy and Rockstar faded into irrelevance after being bought by Pepsi, Monster kept climbing, protected by the red shield of Coke's distribution network and the green shield of its own cultural relevance. Yet the most fascinating aspect of this empire is the invisibility of its architects. In an era of celebrity CEOs where Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are household names, Rodney Sachs and Hilton Schlossberg remain ghosts. They do not tweet. They do not host Saturday Night Live. They do not write memoirs about their management philosophy. They are aging billionaires who prefer the shadows of their Corona, California headquarters to the spotlight of Davos. They are the ultimate mercenaries of capitalism, men who treat the beverage industry not as a passion project, but as a spreadsheet to be optimized. They stripped the emotion out of the business. When the juice heritage of Hansen's stopped making money, they killed it without a tear. When the energy market saturated, they moved into alcohol without a moral qualm. They understood that in a sedated, safe, and sanitized world, there is an infinite, unquenchable market for a can of liquid danger. They built a machine that sells heart palpitations to teenagers and hangovers to adults, and they did it so effectively that they became the kings of the modern market. The beast has been unleashed, it has evolved, and it has conquered the world, the blueprint of a $60 billion empire. As we stand in 2025, looking back at the 90-year trajectory of the Hansens turned Monster empire, we are confronted with a business story that defies the moral logic of the traditional corporate fable. In business school, and in the optimistic branding of the 21st century, we are constantly told that companies succeed by being good. We are told that the future belongs to the sustainable, the organic, the transparent, and the healthy. The story of Monster Beverage Corporation teaches us the exact opposite. It teaches us a brutal, unspoken truth about the modern condition. In the high-stress, high-speed, exhausted reality of the 21st century, health is a niche market, but survival is a mass market. The company that started in 1935, selling fresh, wholesome apple juice to Hollywood stars, ended up becoming the single most successful stock in history, not by sticking to its principles, but by violently abandoning them to sell a neon green chemical sludge to tired truck drivers and gamers. The first and most provocative lesson of this saga is that purity is a poor business model in an exhausted world. Hubert Hansen built a company on nature, on the idea that ingredients should be recognizable and come from the earth. His reward was a slow, polite death, a company that drifted into irrelevance as the world sped up. Rodney Sachs and Hilton Schlossberg built a company on artificiality, on ingredients that sounded like a chemistry experiment. Taurine, glucuronolactone, inositol, and their reward was global domination. They recognized a fundamental shift in the human experience that Coca-Cola and Pepsi were too slow to see. They understood that the modern consumer does not want to be nurtured. They want to be activated. They want a tool. When a kid buys a Monster, they aren't buying a beverage to quench their thirst. They are buying a pharmacological intervention to get them through a double shift, a final exam, or a raid in a video game. Sachs and Schlossberg weaponized the very thing that Hansen's tried to avoid, chemistry, and proved that there is an infinite, recession-proof demand for legal stimulants. The second lesson is the alchemy of value, a lesson in pricing psychology that is as brilliant as it is cynical. When Sachs and Schlossberg launched the original 16-ounce Monster can in 2002, they didn't just create a new product. They hacked the economic brain of the American consumer. At the time, Red Bull was the undisputed king, but it was selling a premium image, a tiny, expensive European can that signaled sophistication. Sachs looked at the shelves and saw that Red Bull was leaving the vast majority of the market behind. He understood that his core customer, the blue-collar worker, the student on a budget, the soldier, didn't want sophistication. They wanted more. They felt cheated by the tiny Red Bull can. By introducing the 16-ounce can at the exact same price point as the 8.3-ounce Red Bull, Monster wasn't just engaging in a price war. They were redefining the definition of value. They tapped into the supersize me instinct of American culture, the deep-seated belief that bigger is always better. They sold gluttony. They sold double the liquid and double the buzz for the same dollar. This strategy turned the energy drink from a luxury mixer for the elite into a democratic utility for the masses. It allowed a small bankrupt juice company to run down and eventually overtake the Austrian giant not by outmarketing them, but by outweighing them. It teaches us that in a crowded market, you don't always have to be better or cooler. Sometimes you just have to be bigger. The 16-ounce can was a physical manifestation of the brand's aggression, a heavy, imposing cylinder that dominated the shelf and made the competition look frail by comparison. However, the third and perhaps most complex lesson lies in the management of controversy, or what we might call the anti-fragile brand. For 20 years, Monster has existed in a state of permanent legal siege. The death of Agnès Fournier, the investigations by the FDA, the accusations of marketing to children, these events would have destroyed a weaker brand. A company like Disney or McDonald's would have been forced to pivot, to apologize, to launch a healthy initiative to cleanse their image. But Sachs and Schlossberg did the opposite. They dug in. They fought every lawsuit. They refused to apologize for the caffeine content. And in doing so, they inadvertently turned the controversy into a brand asset. The health wars reinforced the brand's identity as the bad boy of the beverage world. The warning labels on the can, advising that the drink was not for children or pregnant women, didn't scare away the teenage demographic. They acted as a beacon. They signaled that this drink was potent. It was adult. It was dangerous. In a sanitized world of safety rails, trigger warnings, and organic kale smoothies, Monster became a symbol of illicit risk. The lesson here is that a brand can survive almost any scandal if the scandal reinforces the core promise of the product. The lawsuits claimed the drink was too strong, which, to the consumer looking for a wake-up call, was exactly what they were paying for. The legal attacks validated the product's efficacy more than any advertisement ever could. The final and perhaps most chilling lesson of the Monster saga is about the invisibility of true power. In the modern era, we are accustomed to the celebrity CEO. We expect our titans of industry to be public figures. Elon Musk tweeting at 3 a.m., Mark Zuckerberg testifying before Congress, Jeff Bezos flying into space. We expect them to sell us a vision of the future. But Rodney Sachs and Hilton Schlossberg represent a different, older, and arguably more effective archetype, the ghost. They are billionaires many times over, the architects of a company worth nearly $60 billion. Yet they are virtually unknown to the public who consumes their product. They do not write memoirs. They do not give TED Talks. They do not pretend to be saving the world. They are South African financial operators who treat the beverage industry not as a passion project, but as a spreadsheet to be optimized. This lack of ego is their greatest strength. It allowed them to strip the emotion out of the business entirely. A founder who loved juice would have fought to save Hansen's Natural, perhaps driving the company into bankruptcy out of sentimental loyalty to the orchard. Sachs and Schlossberg felt no such loyalty. When the juice heritage stopped making money, they killed it without a tear. When the natural soda line became a distraction, they traded it away to Coca-Cola like a playing card. When the energy market saturated, they moved into alcohol, a sector with entirely different moral and regulatory complexities, without a second thought. They are the ultimate mercenaries of capitalism. Their legacy is not a mission statement, it is the stock chart. And that chart tells a story of unparalleled success. A $1,000 investment in their company in 2002 would be worth nearly $1 million today, a return that dwarfs Apple, Amazon, and Google. They achieved this by staying in the shadows, letting the M-Claw do the talking, and ruthlessly executing on the numbers. They proved that you don't need to be famous to be powerful. You just need to be right. And amidst this empire of caffeine and algorithms, what remains of the Hansen family? The idealism of 1935 has not just been defeated, it has been completely overwritten. The natural sodas that Hubert Hansen's grandsons tried to save were eventually sold off to Coca-Cola and quietly discontinued, fading into obscurity. The orchards where Hubert once stood are likely paved over, replaced by the very logistics centers that now ship billions of Monster cans. Today, the name Hansen survives only as a microscopic legal footnote on the back of the can, a ghost trapped in the fine print. Rodney Sachs and Hilton Schlossberg didn't just buy a company. They purchased a heritage, hollowed it out, and filled it with the very chemicals Hubert Hansen spent his life avoiding. It is the ultimate capitalist irony. The family name remains, but the family soul has been evicted. Today, the Monster empire is a fortress. It is diversified into alcohol, gaming, and motorsports. It is protected by the distribution might of Coca-Cola. It is insulated from health trends by its sheer cultural dominance. But if you look closely at the black can with the neon green scratch marks, you can still see the ghost of the 1935 orchard, precisely because it is no longer there. The trajectory from Hansen's natural to Monster energy is the story of the 20th century turning into the 21st. It is a story of moving from the garden to the lab, from the sun to the screen, from the natural to the hyper-real. The ingredient list on the back of the can no longer boasts of fresh apples or California sunshine. It lists taurine, Panax ginseng, L-carnitine, and caffeine. It reads like a chemistry set. And this is the final truth. The beast that Sachs and Schlossberg unleashed is not just a drink. It is a mirror. It reflects a world that is tired, overworked, overstimulated, and desperate to feel something, anything, even if it comes from a can. We buy Monster, not because we are thirsty, but because we are exhausted. We buy it because the demands of the modern economy, the gig work, the double shifts, the all-night gaming sessions, the pressure to perform, require a level of energy that the human body cannot naturally produce. Monster Energy didn't create this exhausted world. It simply bottled the antidote. The ultimate lesson of Monster is that you can become the king of the world not by feeding people what they need, but by selling them the energy to survive the world they have built. The beast is not in the can. The beast is the modern world, and Monster is just the fuel we pour into it to keep the machine running for one more hour.